Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Today we are cracking open a really foundational text for understanding modern media. It's a book that sort of laid out the blueprint for how information gets managed, even in societies that call themselves free.
That's right. We're talking about Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky's 1988 work, Manufacturing Consent.
And if you were with us for our look at Edward Bernays and propaganda, well, Bernays gave us the theory, didn't he, how to shape public opinion.
You could think of Manufacturing Consent as the engineering manual that followed. Herman and Chomsky show how that theory actually gets put into practice within modern media systems. It's not about, some obvious ministry of truth, like you might imagine in an old Soviet state.
That's the crucial point, isn't it? It's subtle. So our mission today is really to expose how this system works quietly, effectively, in what the authors call guided market system, basically liberal democracies like ours.
They really set out to challenge that core assumption we often have about democracy, that the media is this independent watchdog, searching for truth, holding power accountable.
Instead, they argue the media often ends up reflecting the world the way powerful groups think. Big corporations, finance, government want it to be seen.
And critically, this isn't achieved through direct orders or censorship most of the time.
Yeah.
It happens through structural things, market forces, what they famously called the 5 filters.
Right. These filters aren't some grand daily conspiracy. They're more like these built-in economic pressures. Just the way the system is set up makes certain outcomes almost unavoidable, if you want to get why news coverage often looks the way it does.
You have to look at the machine producing it. So let's start with the first filter. The bedrock, ownership and the profit motive.
Okay, so the media landscape, especially mass media, is dominated by just a few massive corporations, right?
Huge corporations. We're talking giant conglomerates, deeply woven into the wider market system. And their sheer size means they have to answer to Wall Street.
The authors point out that these are billion-dollar operations. So the pressure from stockholders, from boards of directors, it's relentless. They demand focus on the bottom line.
Yeah, that profit motive shapes everything. Think about it if your parent company, the one owning the news division, also has huge interest in, say, defense contracting or finance.
Then the news division's theoretical commitment to truth is going to run up against the corporation's need to protect its other massive financial interests. It's a conflict baked into the structure.
Absolutely. Which sets up the second filter quite nicely. If ownership demands profit, well, you need a steady way to make money.
And for mass media, that big, reliable stream is advertising. Filter 2.
Cool.
Advertising is the primary revenue source.
Advertising basically acts like a licensing system, in effect. If you can't get advertisers on board, your media outlet just isn't going to survive financially. And this immediately shapes who the media tries to reach. Because advertisers aren't trying to talk to everybody. They're interested in audiences with money to spend, affluent audiences.
Right. So the content itself starts getting tailored to attract and keep that specific audience, the one advertisers want to sell things to.
Which puts any media aimed at, say, working class people or community issues or anything genuinely radical. It puts them at a huge structural disadvantage from the get-go. Advertisers just aren't interested in funding shows for people who aren't likely to buy expensive cars or luxury goods.
So if certain kinds of content, maybe serious documentaries, critical investigations, challenging cultural programs, if that stuff risks turning off those desirable viewers or maybe makes advertisers uncomfortable,
it gets pushed aside. It gets marginalized or just doesn't get made. The priority becomes keeping the ratings up among the buying public, not necessarily informing the whole citizenry.
Okay, that leads us to filter 3. This one feels less like direct financial pressure and more about, the daily grind of journalism, reliance on official sources.
Yeah, this is really about efficiency and the pressures journalists are under. Government departments, big corporate PR offices, they know journalists are working against crazy deadlines. So they make it easy for them. They basically subsidize the news gathering process. They provide pre-written press releases. They give out advanced copies of reports. They stage photo ops.
It's the path of least resistance, isn't it? If you're a reporter who has to file 5 stories by the end of the day,
you're naturally going to gravitate towards those easy, ready-made sources. It's much quicker and cheaper than spending weeks digging into something independently.
And the flip side is true too, right? Going after critical sources or dissident voices.
That takes more time, more effort, it costs more, and crucially, it might tick off the powerful sources you rely on for the easy stuff day to day. You risk losing access.
Yeah, bad for business.
Plus, the authors point out the deliberate use of corporate-funded think tanks. These organizations essentially put experts on their payroll to generate reports and commentary that naturally slant information in a way that benefits the funders. It looks like objective expertise, but it's subsidized information.
Okay, so the system prefers official voices. But what happens if a story does manage to get through those first three filters? Maybe something critical slips out.
Well, that's where filter 4 comes in. Flak and the disciplining of dissent, this is the pushback.
Flak, like anti-aircraft fire, right?
Exactly. It's negative feedback, complaints, pressure campaigns, all designed to punish or discourage journalism that steps out of line.
And this can come from different places.
Sure, it can come directly from government officials complaining, threatening investigations, questioning patriotism, or it can come from highly organized private groups like corporate front groups or ideological pressure groups, often arguing the media as being too negative or un-American.
The book mentions groups like Freedom House, specifically publishing these detailed critiques aimed at pushing the media to be more supportive of, say, U.S. foreign policy.
If a news outlet or a journalist gets hit with enough flack, it sends a message. It raises the cost of doing critical work, people might get reassigned, stories might get killed, and it encourages a kind of self-censorship down the line. You learn what topics are just too much trouble.
And the final piece, filter 5, anti-ideology.
Back in 1988, when they wrote the book, the dominant ideology used as a control mechanism was anti-communism. It was the ultimate framework for mobilizing public opinion, justifying interventions, framing conflicts.
Everything was seen through that Cold War lens.
Pretty much. But the filter itself, the mechanism, is adaptable. Today, that binding ideology might be the fight against terrorism, or countering a specific rival nation, or even something more abstract like combating disinformation.
So it provides a shared enemy, a shared worldview.
Yes, and that shared lens allows for what they called a systematic dichotomization in news coverage, a stark difference in how victims are treated.
Yeah, the worthy versus unworthy victims concept.
Exactly. Victims of official enemies, they become worthy victims. Their suffering gets intense focus, generates outrage, rallies patriotism. Think about the coverage volume, the emotional language used, the photos shown.
But victims of actions by the U.S. or its allies or client states?
They tend to become unworthy victims. Their stories are downplayed, marginalized, maybe briefly mentioned without the same moral weight or emotional framing. The amount and type of coverage depend entirely on who did what to whom, judged against that dominant ideology.
So if you put all 5 filters together, ownership pressure, advertising demands, reliance on official sources, the threat of flack, and this overarching ideology,
you get this powerful system that shapes the news agenda without needing direct censorship. And that links to the paradox they talk about.
The liberal democracy paradox, the idea that propaganda can actually be more effective here, where the media seems free, than in a place with obvious state control. How does that work?
Well, because the control relies on these market forces, and, importantly, on internalized assumptions. It's not usually someone telling a journalist, don't report that. Right. It's that the constraints are so embedded in the routines, the economics, the culture of the newsroom,
that alternatives just don't seem possible.
Right. The authors argue that most media professionals operate with, complete integrity and goodwill. They genuinely believe they're being objective, but the powerful constraints are just built into the system they work within. Certain questions just don't get asked. Certain angles aren't pursued because they fall outside the accepted framework.
It's like you're free to walk anywhere inside the factory, but the factory walls and the assembly lines still determine what you produce.
That's a good analogy. The control is largely invisible because the press isn't subject to overt daily censorship. In fact, allowing a small amount of dissent, maybe a critical op-ed on page A28, it lends it credibility. The mainstream can point to that marginalized critique and say, see, we allow dissent, even while the dominant narrative, shaped by the filters, remains firmly in place. The appearance of freedom masks the deeper structural controls.
Okay, this next part is where it gets particularly interesting, maybe even a bit uncomfortable, especially for people who see themselves as critics.
Yes, the idea that even those who think they're pushing back, taking an adversarial stance, can still be operating entirely within the boundaries set by the propaganda system.
How so?
The key is when the terms of the debate are narrowly constrained, usually limited to disagreements among elites about tactics, rather than questioning the fundamental goals or premises. Their prime example was the media debate around the Vietnam War, especially later on.
Right, because by the late 60s, early 70s, there was a lot of media criticism of the war, wasn't there? It wasn't all just government cheerleading.
No, definitely not. But Herman and Chomsky argue that the nature of that criticism was revealing. It almost always focused on the costs of the war. Too many American lives, too much money, was it winnable? It became a debate about the utility of the war.
But not about whether the U.S. should have been there in the first place.
Rarely, and certainly not in the mainstream. The fundamental premise, the idea of American benevolence, the righteousness of the American cause, that generally remained unchallenged within the mainstream debate. The possibility that the U.S. intervention was itself fundamentally wrong, an act of aggression, not just a mistake or too costly.
That was basically off the table, unthinkable.
Largely unrecognized is how they phrase it. So even the sharpest critics, by focusing only on tactics and costs, inadvertently reinforced the underlying assumption that the U.S. had a right to intervene, that its motives were essentially good, even to the execution was flawed.
So the system managed to contain the debate within acceptable limits.
And this raises a really crucial point. If even smart, critical people who genuinely oppose certain policies, can get trapped within the foundational assumptions set by the system, if they can't even see the premise that needs questioning.
Then what does that mean for the rest of us? It's just the framework itself is incredibly powerful.
It really highlights the power of internalized assumptions and, yes, self-censorship. When even the critics focus on how to wage the war better, rather than whether to wage it at all, it shows how dominant the underlying propaganda framework can be. It sets the bounds of thought itself.
It makes you realize that just being smart or critical isn't enough. You need something more. A radical kind of media literacy, maybe.
That's what they argue. So let's bring this up to date. This book was 1988. How does this propaganda model hold up in our, hyper-digital internet age?
It feels like it might be even more relevant in some ways.
Yeah, I think so. The authors themselves argued later that the system has likely become more efficient. You have even greater media concentration now. The PR industry is vastly more sophisticated, and everything is commercialized.
And the filters. How do they translate? Filter 1, ownership. Still huge media conglomerates, plus now giant tech platforms controlling information flow.
And filter 2, advertising. It's arguably more powerful than ever online. The entire model of platforms like Google and Facebook is built on harvesting user data to sell targeted ads. The newsfeeds themselves are driven by algorithms designed to maximize engagement for advertisers.
So the profit motive shapes what you even see in your feed? Prioritizing maybe outrage or emotion, because that keeps you clicking, keeps you scrolling.
Keeps the ad revenue flowing. It's filter 2 on steroids, really.
Yeah.
And filter 3, sources, still relevant. Official sources still dominate, maybe even more so with shrinking newsroom budgets. Plus, you have the sophisticated digital PR operations feeding information constantly.
And filter 4, the Flak.
Oh, that's definitely evolved. Instead of just letters to the editor, you have these massive coordinated online campaigns. Organized mobs on social media ready to pile on, shame, deplatform, or cancel anyone, journalist, academic, ordinary citizen who steps outside the perceived consensus. The Flak is instantaneous and often brutal.
Even filter 5, the anti-ideology, feels more fluid now, maybe.
Yeah, maybe less focused on a single state enemy like the Soviet Union. Now the enemy can be more abstract: terrorism, disinformation, extremism, foreign influence. These are terms that the state and powerful media can define and apply quite broadly to enforce conformity and discredit dissent.
So the basic machinery, it's still there. It's just adapted, maybe even accelerated for the digital world.
I think that's a fair assessment. The mechanisms are remarkably persistent.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what's the key takeaway for you, the listener, navigating this environment? If this model holds true, what do we do?
Well, the first step is just understanding the system exists. Recognizing these filters are operating is crucial. Beyond that, it comes down to practicing a really active, critical form of media literacy.
Don't just consume the news passively.
Ask those core questions Herman and Chomsky raise. When you encounter a major story, don't just absorb the information, interrogate the framework. Who benefits if I believe this narrative?
Who funded this study? Who owns this outlet? What voices are being amplified?
And just as importantly, who is being silenced? What perspectives, what inconvenient facts are being left out or minimized?
It also sounds like diversifying your media diet is essential, not just reading things you agree with, but actively seeking out independent sources, maybe international perspectives, voices that challenge the mainstream consensus shaped by those filters.
Absolutely. Supporting genuinely independent media becomes vital if you want reporting that isn't primarily beholden to corporate owners and advertisers.
So understanding the system is step 1. Practicing radical media literacy is step 2.
And the author's final point, the really challenging one, is that ultimately, achieving a truly free and democratic media system probably requires more than just individual awareness. It requires collective action.
People organizing, educating themselves, pushing back against the pressures of the filters, demanding media that serves the public, not just powerful interests.
That's the long-term project they point towards, contesting the dominant system itself.
So perhaps the most provocative thought to leave you with is this. If the propaganda system works best by limiting what we even consider thinkable, the most radical act isn't just disagreeing with a policy, but questioning the fundamental assumptions and premises that underpin the entire debate in the first place.
Finding ways to step outside the factory wall, so to speak. That's the real challenge.